Dim the lights, my friend. Let the phone rest softly in your hands or beside your pillow so its glow becomes a quiet ember in the room. Pull a blanket over your shoulders and feel its weight draw the world down into silence. Whatever today brought, however loud or sharp or fast, it's finished now. For the next long while, nothing will ask anything of you. There is only this soft story, slow as a fading breath, meant to lull the mind and ease you gently into sleep. Let your thoughts loosen. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let the hum of this tale carry you back, not just in years, but in feeling, in rhythm, in the texture of time worn smooth by repetition and quiet resilience. You are about to walk into a different century, where every footstep matters, and every flicker of firelight holds a memory. We begin in a village so old, its name is nearly forgotten. Tucked between wooded hills and the winding fingers of a shallow stream, it rests quietly in the dip of a valley. The cottages here lean like tired friends into one another, thatch stitched tight against wind and rain, their walls warmed by generations of breath and fire. It is morning, but the sun is still a pale suggestion behind the mist. Smoke rises from a dozen crooked chimneys, drifting upward in ribbons of grey that vanish into the slow-moving sky. Roosters call, sheep rustle in pens, and somewhere in the distance, a wooden door creaks open, beginning another day. In one small home, a man bends over his hearth, coaxing flame from the embers left from the night before. He blows softly, like speaking to an old friend, and the fire stirs, stretching itself awake. His wife moves quietly behind him, drawing water from a bucket with stiff hands, pouring it into a clay pot to warm. Their children sleep on a loft above, curled like kittens beneath wool and patched linen. Soon, the smell of oats and ash will rise, and the village will breathe itself into life. Outside, a young girl walks the worn path to the well, balancing an empty pail in each hand. Her boots are damp from the grass, and her breath floats in front of her like a spirit. She passes the chapel, its bells still quiet, and nods to the stone carving of the Virgin in the niche above the door. A superstition, maybe, or a quiet ritual of protection. Her grandmother taught her to greet the Virgin each morning, and some things once learned settle deep and stay. The village itself is simple, a scatter of homes, a chapel, a smithy, a mill down by the water's edge. There is a single road that winds through, packed hard with centuries of footsteps, cartwheels, and hoof prints. Fields stretch beyond it, edged with low stone walls and hedgerows. Beyond them, the forest waits, dark and vast, a world unto itself. This morning, like most, the villagers move with purpose. There is no time for idleness here. The blacksmith is already at work, his hammer ringing softly against the anvil like a distant heartbeat. A boy drives geese toward the stream, his voice low, nudging them along with a crooked stick. A mother gathers her children for morning prayers, their voices echoing softly through the open door. Life here is not easy, but it is steady, predictable, in a way that comforts more than it confines. The seasons carve the shape of every day. The sun tells time, the church marks the rhythm of weeks, and the land, stingy, generous, indifferent, decides the rest. In one cottage, an old man sits carving wood. His fingers are gnarled, knuckles swollen with age, but still they work with quiet skill. He is shaping a spoon from a sliver of applewood, humming as he does. Around him, herbs dry in bunches from the beams, thyme, sage, marjoram. The scent is sharp but pleasant. His wife, long gone, used to tend the herb garden. He keeps it now, though he rarely cooks with them. It feels like tending her memory. A knock at the door brings a child, a neighbor's son, with a splinter in his finger and watery eyes. The old man sets aside the spoon and gently takes the boy's hand, murmuring comfort. He works the sliver out with the tip of a bone needle, dabs the wound with salve, and sends the boy home with a small apple and a pat on the head. Outside, the clouds part slightly. Light spills across the fields, catching the dew on the grass and the worn edges of rooftops. In the distance, a bell rings. Not for mass, but for work. An old tradition. A signal for the laborers to gather near the manor's grain barn. The steward will give the day's assignments. Men with shovels, boys with baskets, women with strong backs and quiet strength. They arrive slowly, quietly. No one speaks much. There is a dignity in silence here, a shared understanding that words are not always needed. The steward, tall and wrapped in wool, unrolls a list and begins. Today, the barley will be turned, the compost spread. The wall near the orchard reinforced. Winter is only months away, and already its breath is on the wind. One woman, her belly rounded with pregnancy, is sent to the orchard anyway. She accepts the task with a small nod and walks off alone, her feet steady on the uneven path. She will fill her basket with windfall apples, some bruised, some sweet, some rotting at the core. They will be boiled into cider or sliced thin and dried. Nothing is wasted. Not here. Near the orchard, a young man digs at the earth with a rusted spade. He is new to the village, arrived with no name and few words. Some whisper that he was cast out from another town. Others think he's simply running from a war, a debt, or something worse. But he works hard, and that's what matters. He digs in rhythm, breath and muscle, breath and muscle. Each clump of soil turned is a small offering to the earth. Back in the village, the chapel doors swing open for midday prayer. Not everyone comes, but most do. The priest is elderly, voice thin but kind. He reads from the Latin, though few understand it fully. Still, the cadence is familiar, comforting. The chapel smells of beeswax, stone, and damp wood. The windows are small and warped, their colored panes casting gentle light onto bowed heads. After the service, bread is broken. A loaf from the baker, slices passed by hand. Soft laughter rises as children play beneath the altar steps. An old woman weeps quietly in the corner, though no one asks why. Grief here is like weather. It comes, it passes, it comes again. Later, a storm rolls in. Slow at first, just a shifting of the clouds, a murmur of wind through the trees, then faster, louder. Rain begins to fall in sheets. The fields darken, the roofs drip. The road becomes a stream of mud and straw. Inside the homes, candles are lit, shutters closed. The village becomes a pocket of flickering light in a wet, grey world. In one home, a family huddles near the fire. The father tells stories of dragons and saints, of kings and fools. His daughter listens wide-eyed, her fingers twisting in the hem of her dress. His wife knits by the hearth, the click of her needles steady as a drum. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, the world feels warm and whole. Another family listens to the storm in silence. They've lost someone recently, a son. Fever took him in 3 days. He was buried under the willow. The mother's eyes are hollow now. The father speaks only when necessary. Their surviving child sleeps fitfully, clutching a carved toy against her chest. In this world, sorrow is a constant, but so is endurance. When the storm passes, the air is sweet with petrichor and pine. The roads are soaked, but the sky has cleared, stars winking into view one by one. Somewhere near the woods, a fox slinks between the trees. An owl watches from a high branch, still and silent. And in the village, the fires burn low again. The day fades, the people sleep, but their story continues. In the crack of morning bread crusts, in the scrape of a hoe against stone, in the hush of prayer whispered through cracked lips, their lives were small, perhaps, measured in spoonfuls, in seeds, in hand-stitched seams. But they were full. Every day a mosaic of labor, laughter, grief, and hope. The land was not gentle, the lords were not kind, the heavens were often silent, but still they lived. And that, dear listener, is where the true miracle lies. The following morning arrived with a thick hush over the fields. The air felt heavy, soaked with the memory of the storm. Water clung to every blade of grass, every branch, every rafter. A milky mist hung low, swirling like breath as the village slowly awoke. No bell marked the hour, only the quiet shuffle of boots on packed earth, the creak of a barn door, the first call of a raven. The fog softened everything it touched, blurring the outlines of rooftops and hedgerows. It was as though the village had been dipped into a dream, half real, half memory. A woman in a coarse linen dress crossed the lane, balancing a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside it were 2 strips of salted pork, some dried beans, and a charm tied with red thread. She walked to the edge of the woods and left the bundle on a stump, a quiet offering, a habit passed down from her grandmother and her grandmother before that. Whether it was for luck or protection or simple gratitude, even she wasn't sure anymore. Meanwhile, in the square, the steward stood with a scroll of names. His voice, hoarse from age and weather, called out assignments in short bursts. Ditches needed clearing. The woodpile near the chapel had fallen, and one of the oxen was limping. Someone would need to walk it to the healer 2 villages over. Among the crowd stood a boy of barely 13, clenching his hands against the morning cold. It was his first day of assigned labor. Until now, he had been kept close to home, helping his mother gather eggs or weed the herb patch. But with his father lost to fever last winter, it was time. He listened as his name was called and was handed a dull spade. He did not speak, only nodded, and set off for the southern field where the soil would be stubborn and wet. He wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But as he trudged alone down the slope, the size of the world seemed to grow around him. The field stretched wide, rimmed with low trees whose leaves had begun to yellow. The earth squelched beneath his boots. He gripped the spade and began to dig, one breath at a time, just like his father taught him. Elsewhere, an old woman with silver-threaded braids and a bent back made her way through the village, tapping her staff on the stones as she walked. People greeted her softly, nodding without smiles. She had been the midwife for nearly 50 years. Had caught hundreds of children, whispered prayers over the dying, and buried 3 of her own. Her face was lined deeply, but her eyes were sharp. In one hand she carried a basket of cloth, herbs, and a small flask of honeyed wine. She stopped at a door where a girl labored inside, her first child, barely more than a child herself. The cries came in low waves. The old woman entered without knocking. Birth waited for no invitation. Hours passed. Inside the hut, steam curled from the kettle. The girl's face was slick with sweat. Her fingers clawed into the wool blanket. The old woman whispered in her ear, firm but kind. She worked with practiced care, palms steady, voice even. When the child finally came, she wrapped it in linen and placed it in the girl's arms. A son. Small, but strong. The room held its breath. Then the mother laughed, exhausted, shaking, but bright with a joy too big for her frame. Outside, the mist had begun to lift. In the upper field, the grain had grown tall and golden, swaying in slow waves beneath the breeze. A group of laborers worked in rhythm, swinging sickles in wide arcs. The sound of steel-cutting stalk, the rustle of bundled sheaves, the occasional low hum of a work song. It was the kind of day that drew sweat and sunburn, but also satisfaction. Harvest was the lifeblood of the village. A good yield meant survival. A bad one meant hunger, or worse. One man paused to stretch his back. His hands were covered in small cuts, his shoulders stiff. He looked across the field to the ridge, where a lone pine stood watch. His wife used to say it looked like a guardian. She'd been gone 3 winters now, taken by the coughing plague that swept through the valley. He still saw her sometimes in dreams, standing by that pine, her hair lit gold by the morning light. He went back to cutting. At the edge of the forest, children gathered under a broad oak, chasing the last fireflies of summer. Their laughter rose into the trees, light and unburdened. One girl wore a crown of woven reeds, declaring herself queen of the glade. Another boy had caught a frog and claimed it spoke to him. They ran wild, their game stitched from sticks, feathers, and the limitless imagination of youth. In one of the cottages, a candle burned beside a bed. A man lay pale and feverish, his breath coming in shallow pools. His sister dipped a rag in cool water and pressed it to his forehead. She sang to him, an old lullaby about a bird who carried wishes on its wings. He hadn't opened his eyes in a day, but as her voice trembled on the final verse, his lips moved faintly, mouthing the words he used to sing as a boy. She wept quietly, grateful for that small response. The village healer arrived just after nightfall, robes damp with travel and hands stained from roots. She checked the man's pulse, lifted his eyelids, listened to his chest. Then she placed her satchel on the floor and began to work. Poultices, infusions, gentle instructions whispered like prayer. Sometimes healing was a miracle. Other times it was simply time. Back near the square, the baker worked late. The ovens roared, and the scent of yeast and ash thickened the air. He shaped loaves with tired hands, dusted them with coarse flour, and stacked them onto wooden boards. He liked this part of the day, the quiet hum of dough beneath his palms, the steady rhythm of rise and bake, rise and bake. It reminded him of childhood, of watching his father knead dough at the same table, whistling low, dusting his son's nose with flour. The bread would feed the village come morning. But tonight, the baker cut a still warm piece for himself, spread it with honey, and sat by the fire. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. Outside, the stars had returned. Crisp and bright above the rooftops, they filled the sky with quiet stories of their own. The constellations were old companions. The villagers knew them by name. Not the names found in the scribes' books, but their own. The coward's hook, the sleeping maiden, the watcher's wheel. Stories passed down by firelight, reshaped over centuries. Children stared upward, faces turned to the night, pointing and whispering. Grandparents told tales of heroes and lovers, of monsters and miracles that lived in the sky. No one questioned the truth of it. Truth in the village wasn't found in parchment or ink. It was found in bread shared, hands held, and stars watched together. And still, the days moved forward. The harvest waned. The trees reddened. Geese gathered in the fields, preparing to leave. The air turned dry and sharp, curling smoke from every chimney. Winter whispered through the branches, promising frost. Preparations began in earnest. Wood was chopped and stacked. Casks of cider were sealed. Wool was spun and woven into thick cloaks. Boots were mended. Herbs were hung to dry. The wise woman visited each home, checking stores, sharing advice, sometimes leaving charms made of pine needles and red thread. In the village square, the children helped string garlands of leaves to hang from the chapel eaves. It was nearly All Saints' Eve, and the priest had planned a small festival, part solemn, part joyous, a remembrance for the dead, a blessing for the living. Candles were lit in every window. On the night of the festival, the village glowed. People wore wreaths of rosemary and holly. Small lanterns were carried on poles, and a slow procession wound its way to the chapel. Prayers were said. Names of the lost were spoken aloud, each one followed by a soft chime of the bell. Tears were shed, but smiles too. Grief and love walked hand in hand. Afterward, there was a feast. Not grand, nothing ever was here, but generous. Flatbread, stewed beans, dried apples, and goat cheese. Someone played a fiddle. Children danced. Old men clapped. Young lovers stole away beneath the trees, laughter low and breath warm against the chill. And when the night grew too cold, they returned to their homes, to fires, to beds, to silence. And the village slept. The wind changed the next morning. It no longer drifted softly through the branches or danced playfully over the fields. It bit quietly at first like a whisper with teeth. The leaves that had blushed gold and rust were now scattered, brittle underfoot. Trees stood half naked, their branches thin and aching. The earth itself seemed to draw its breath in, tensing for the months ahead. In the village, the change was felt without need for discussion. Everyone moved a little faster. Boots were patched again. Thatch was inspected for leaks. Hens were brought indoors to the lower levels of homes. Even the cats grew heavier in their coats, curling closer to the hearth, more willing to be still. Inside one cottage, a woman stirred a thick pot of lentils. She added a sliver of dried meat, crushed garlic, a sprig of thyme. Each step was deliberate. Nothing wasted. Her daughter sat nearby, helping peel roots and humming a lullaby neither of them remembered learning. The song simply existed in them, passed down in tone and touch rather than ink or parchment. In another home, a widow rubbed wax onto her husband's old boots. He had died 4 winters ago, but she still cared for his things. Not because she expected him back, but because tending them kept him near. The boots would go to her grandson now, nearly grown. He had his grandfather's eyes and, more importantly, his quiet way of listening before speaking. That kind of patience was rare. Outside, the sky had turned a deeper gray. A kind of thick, woolen silence blanketed the village. Somewhere, a crow cawed. A boy tossed a stone into the frozen puddle outside his home, watching it skitter and crack. He didn't mind the cold yet. Children still chased each other through the smoke-sweet air, their laughter rising and swirling like breath from the rooftops. But the adults knew better. The true cold had not yet arrived. At the chapel, the priest prepared his winter sermon. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, not from age, but from memory. This season always brought ghosts. Every winter there were names added to the chapel wall, some old, some much too young. And every winter he prayed the same prayer, one of mercy, endurance, and light. That evening, he would read from the Book of Hours. Not the Latin. He had learned by now that most villagers found little comfort in language they did not understand. Instead, he would speak plainly, gently. He would remind them that darkness was not a punishment, only a season. That warmth could be made from kindness and company as surely as it could from firewood. That even the longest nights passed. And so the village began its slow retreat into winter. The miller locked his wheel before the frost could split the wood. The blacksmith's forge burned lower, conserving coal. The healer stocked her shelves with dried feverfew and elderberry, preparing for the inevitable coughs and chills that would make their rounds. She also made small packets of dried lavender, tied with blue string, to tuck beneath pillows. Not because lavender could heal, but because sleep could. Soon, the first snow arrived. It came quietly, without wind or ceremony. One morning, the rooftops were bare. By midday, they were sugar-coated. Children squealed and ran outside to catch flakes on their tongues. Dogs barked, skidding through the drifts. Even the sheep in their pens seemed to watch the white sky with a kind of baffled wonder. Inside the homes, everything changed. Cloaks and gloves dried by the fire. Meals grew simpler but heavier. Barley, dried beans, thick stews. Families huddled together in shared warmth. Bedtimes came earlier. Stories stretched longer. Candles were lit more frequently, their glow dancing in the warped glass of tiny windows. One family, father, mother, 3 children, had fashioned a game out of surviving the winter. Every day they found a reason to celebrate something small, the discovery of an extra carrot at the bottom of a barrel, the moment the sun broke through the clouds, the fact that no one had yet caught the cough. They drew tally marks on the wall with charcoal, one for each day endured, and sang a song at every 7th mark. Their joy wasn't naive. It was armor. Down the road, an elderly couple shared silence more often than words. After 50 years of marriage, they had said most things that needed saying. Now they simply sat, her with her knitting, him with his sharpening stone, letting the hours fold around them like worn blankets. Every few nights, she would pull out a game board he had carved in his youth. They played slowly, deliberately, often forgetting whose turn it was. The winner never mattered. Near the edge of the village, in a home with a crooked chimney and 3-legged cat, lived a woman some called odd. She spoke to her jars, left offerings at the base of trees, and read fortunes in melted wax. But she was kind. She kept the children laughing with stories of talking goats and mischievous winds. And when the cold settled deepest, she would leave warm loaves on doorsteps. No name, no note, just kindness delivered in crust and crumb. When sickness came, and it always did, it came first with a cough, then a fever, then silence. Not every winter took someone, but every winter asked. It asked the body to endure. It asked, they liked the way his voice dropped low and raspy when he described frost that could crack a pot in half, or snowdrifts that reached the chapel bell. One day, while sipping broth and watching the snowfall, he told a visitor, "The frost speaks if you listen, but not in words. It tells you when to slow, when to wait, when to huddle near the fire and let the world turn without you." And so they waited. The days stretched long and dim. Time blurred into the soft monotony of survival. Some villagers passed the time by crafting, mending, whittling, darning. Others composed songs or recited old poems. The baker's daughter had taken to pressing dried flowers into scraps of vellum, inventing names for each imaginary species she created. Frost petal, she whispered to one pale bud, ice thorn to another. But even in the quiet, life pressed on. A woman near the stream gave birth to twins in late January. Both boys, their cries strong and clear against the snow-dampened world. The midwife smiled, then winced. Her hands ached more than usual. She didn't say anything, just wrapped the babies tightly, gave the mother water, and stared out the window for a while, watching the trees sway beneath the weight of the snow. Elsewhere, an apprentice blacksmith took it upon himself to repair every bent nail and broken hinge in the village. It gave him purpose, and more importantly, it gave him reason to visit the healer's daughter, who always had something in need of fixing. He didn't mind. She had the kind of laugh that warmed more than the forge ever could. In the stillness of winter, small romances bloomed, silent and slow as moss creeping over stone. Eyes lingered longer across the communal table, hands brushed by accident and then by design. A scarf left behind was returned with a smile. No declarations, just a quiet understanding. You and I are here in this season together. But winter wasn't always gentle. Some weeks, the wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the shutters, slipping beneath doors, setting every dog in the village to barking. One evening, a fierce storm rolled down from the hills, bending trees, burying paths, tearing shingles loose from roofs. Families huddled in corners, candles flickering. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers stood by the fire, eyes fixed on the door as if watching for something that might break it down. When the storm passed, the world looked carved from ice. The snow was blinding. Fences had vanished beneath drifts. Livestock had to be dug out, led inside, given warmth. One calf, too young and too cold, did not make it. The next day, the village gathered to help one another, fixing roofs, freeing trapped wagons, shoveling paths. No one asked who needed help. Everyone simply showed up. It was how they'd survived every winter before, and how they would survive this one too. Not because they were strong, but because they were not alone. And sometimes in the heart of winter, there came moments of joy that felt like miracles. A boy found a bird's nest nestled in the eaves of the well house, empty but still whole, its tiny twigs woven so delicately it seemed impossible. He brought it inside, showed it to his mother, and they placed it on a shelf above the hearth, a promise that spring would come. A girl discovered that the icicles hanging from the chapel roof made different notes when tapped with a spoon. She played them like bells, composing a song that the whole village came to hear. A dog gave birth to a litter of pups behind the old granary, and for days the children could talk of nothing else. They named the smallest one Winter Drop and carried him around in the front of someone's cloak. The snow began to melt in March, not quickly, but persistently. First the south-facing slopes, then the thatched roofs, then the hollow near the chapel where the snow always lingered longest. Little rivulets formed along the paths, water trickling like laughter returning to a silent room. Mud returned too. Squishy, thick, clinging to boots and hems and hooves, but no one complained. Mud meant the thaw was working, that the earth was waking, that seeds would soon be pressed into softened soil and lambs would bleat from the hills again. Inside the homes, windows were cracked just slightly, letting in the sharp scent of melting snow and wet bark. Fireplaces still burned, but not constantly. People shed layers, smiled more. And then one morning, someone saw the first crocus. The crocus appeared near the edge of the wood, shy and bright as a lantern in fog. Its tiny violet petals curled open despite the lingering cold, nodding gently in the breeze as if it too was unsure the worst had passed. The girl who spotted it didn't speak. She only knelt beside it, cupping her hands around the bloom for a moment as though trying to keep it warm. Then she ran back to the village, mud flicking behind her. A single word blooming from her lips, spring. The word passed from house to house like fire kindling through dry grass. Spring. It didn't matter that frost still hung to the eaves or that the last barrel of grain had been scraped thin. What mattered was the idea, the promise. A shift in the wind, a lengthening of light. One by one, doors were left open longer. Bed sheets hung outside for the first time in months. Chickens clucked with new energy. And children. Oh, the children ran. They ran for no reason but that they could. That their feet no longer stuck in snow or stumbled on frozen ruts. That their lungs, once tight from the smoke of indoor fires, filled now with cold, wet air that tasted of moss and sky. A boy fashioned a kite from parchment scraps and spare twine. It didn't fly well, but he didn't care. He danced beneath it as it sputtered and dipped, calling to it like a falconer to a bird. His grandfather watched from the doorway, arms crossed, face cracked with the beginnings of a smile. The thaw did not erase hardship. There were still coughs lingering in the lungs of the old, and a few bellies that would growl until the first fresh greens poked through the earth. But it changed something deeper. Where winter had folded the village inward, tucked it into itself like a creature hibernating, spring unfolded it again. Neighbors gathered outside to mend fences together. Tools passed hand to hand without question. Someone began patching the chapel's roof. Another brought a ladder without being asked. A young woman planted herbs beside the healer's door, mint, sage, tansy. Her fingers were stained, her knees wet from kneeling, but her eyes shone. And with spring came songs, old ones mostly, melodies with no known author, rhythms carried from grandmother's lips. Songs for planting, for waking the soil, for reminding the seeds they were loved. Even those who didn't sing hummed. Even those who hummed did so with purpose, their tune a kind of soft invocation. Let this year be gentle, let the rains be kind, let the wheat grow tall. One evening after the sun had slipped behind the hills, a group gathered in the clearing near the oak. They did not plan it, Someone simply began to walk, and others followed. There was no celebration to name, no Saints' Day to observe, only the feeling that it was time to be together under open sky again. They lit torches, but only a few. The stars did most of the work. A flute was brought, then a drum, then nothing at all but hands clapping and voices joining. The songs weren't about anything specific, just warmth, light, each other. They danced in a slow circle, some swaying, some stepping lightly, others just watching. At the edge of the circle stood the oldest villager, leaning on his cane, eyes reflecting firelight. He nodded once to no one in particular. The seasons would turn again, as they always had. By the second week of planting, the fields were a patchwork of effort, rows and rows of brown earth, scored and softened, waiting to be filled. Each family had their own rhythm. Some began at dawn, breaking fast only once the sun climbed high. Others waited for the mist to burn off. There was no competition, only shared labor, shared exhaustion, shared hope. Children carried seed bags. Women dropped lentils and beans into furrows. Men tamped earth gently with worn boots. And the sky, wide and watching, offered its shifting moods in silence. One morning, a rain came so sudden and brief it soaked the backs of shirts but left the fields warm and steaming. No one cursed it. Rain was life. In the evenings, aches set in, shoulders burned, palms blistered. But these were good pains, honest ones. Pains that meant food would grow. Inside one cottage, a boy kept a small sprout by the window. He'd found it growing wild behind the well, pulled it carefully and replanted it in a chipped cup. Every morning he checked it, watered it, whispered to it as he'd seen the healer do. He named it Mirren, though he never said why. Elsewhere, two sisters repurposed an old cloak into a scarecrow. They stuffed it with straw, drew a smiling face, and perched it among the barley. They gave it a name, too, Sir Bramble. Each day they checked on him, fixing his crooked cap, retying his arms when the wind blew too hard. The birds seemed unimpressed, but the girls believed in him entirely. Belief mattered. There were still hungry days. The larder did not magically refill. The first greens were bitter, the roots fibrous. But they were enough. Enough to remind the tongue that flavor existed, enough to nudge the body back toward strength. And still, the chapel bells rang, not just for death or mass, but for things the village deemed worthy, the birth of a calf, the safe return of a traveling son, the marriage of two who had courted all winter with soft smiles and shy glances. Bells for beginnings, bells for blooming, and beneath all of it, a slow, steady awareness that time, like the wheel of a cart, rolled forward. A new child was born, an elder passed in her sleep. A crop failed, another flourished, a window cracked, a song was written, a friendship deepened, a hurt was forgiven. Life, in all its quiet messiness, pressed on. And one day, while cleaning the loft of his family's barn, a boy found something strange. A bundle of letters, tied with red string, each one written in a careful hand. They were not addressed to anyone, just thoughts, observations, hopes. The boy read one aloud to the goat beside him. I saw a fox today near the river. He watched me as though he knew my name. I did not speak. I only bowed. He blinked, then disappeared. The boy blinked too, then smiled. He tucked the letter back in place and left the rest unread. Some stories were better kept secret. By late spring, the village smelled of wet soil and growing things. The air had a sweetness to it again, not the perfumed kind of summer flowers, but the richer scent of living earth, green stems and sun-warmed bark. The trees had leafed out fully now, dappling the roads with light that moved and danced as the breeze stirred overhead. Bees returned to the world. So did the small winged things that hummed in gardens, flitting from herb to herb, trailing golden dust wherever they went. One of the older boys built a bench beneath the sycamore tree near the edge of the commons. It wasn't fancy, just 3 wide boards resting on flat stones, but it held, and that was what mattered. The elders quickly adopted it as their meeting place. There, they traded stories, repaired baskets, and passed around roasted turnips wrapped in cloth. They called it the listening seat, though no one said why. Every village had its invisible rituals, unspoken, unplanned things that simply became. A knock twice on the healer's door meant you needed help but couldn't pay. A cluster of blue thread tied to a window meant the family inside was grieving. A straw doll left on the chapel steps was a wish for health, left by someone too proud or too scared to ask aloud. These signs were never questioned. They were honored. In the stillness between chores, life unfolded in moments. A child losing his first tooth and proudly hiding it beneath his straw mattress. A shepherd waking before the sun to find a lamb born in the night, slick and blinking, nestled beside its exhausted mother. A widow tracing the carvings her husband had etched into the edge of their table years before his passing, the indentations worn smooth by time and use. And then there were the voices, shared memories carried on the wind, stories of a man who once baked bread so good it made rivals cry, of a girl who danced on the chapel roof at dawn one midsummer just because she believed it would make the sun rise faster, of a long ago winter when the snow came so thick the village had to dig tunnels between houses like burrowing moles. The truth of these tales was less important than their warmth. They lived in the telling. And even as new memories were made, the old ones lingered. Children played a game in the fields called Crown the Hedge King. One child would wear a circle of brambles and declare silly laws, like no one can walk without hopping or only purple flowers are allowed today. The others obeyed with wild laughter until the crown passed to the next ruler. It was nonsense, but it was theirs. A legacy in the making. Down by the mill, where the stream spun its wheel day and night, a pair of friends sat on the banks and tried to catch frogs with cups. They failed spectacularly, again and again, but each attempt was more hilarious than the last. When one finally scooped up a frog, they both screamed, not out of fear, but disbelief. The frog leapt away before they could admire it, and they spent the rest of the afternoon reenacting the moment for anyone who'd listen. Life in the village was not exciting by the standards of kings or scholars. But it was full. It was rich in detail, in shared breath, in little triumphs and tiny griefs. People remembered each other's favorite foods, each other's scars, the stories behind each person's silence. A bruise, a limp, a laugh too loud, nothing was hidden in a place this small. And yet, the knowing was gentle. At the market, which returned in full once the roads dried, people traded not just goods, but words. Recipes were exchanged beside baskets of eggs. Jokes were traded along with wheels of cheese. A visiting traveler with a lyre played a song no one knew, and within minutes a dozen voices had joined the chorus, inventing harmonies as they went. The lyre player stayed 3 nights, sleeping in a hayloft and living on gifted bread. When he left, he gave the baker's son a single string from his instrument and told him to tie it around his wrist for courage. The boy never took it off, even years later when the color faded and the knot frayed. Spring passed slowly into summer. The fields turned gold. Wheat swayed in long breaths beneath the sun. The air grew heavier, the hours lazier. Even work changed, less frantic, more rhythmic. Harvest was still weeks away, but the land felt full, like a belly after a feast. On the village green, someone set up a table with a checkerboard carved into the top. No one confessed to making it. It simply appeared, and by silent agreement, it stayed. Flat stones were used for pieces, light and dark. Old men played early in the day, younger ones at dusk, children sneaking turns in between. Games took hours. No one minded. They weren't played to win. The priest, once stiff and formal, began to laugh more. He took off his sandals to feel the earth beneath his feet, shocking everyone. He let the children braid flowers into his beard, and though he protested with theatrical grumbles, he left the flowers in during Mass. It made the people love him more. Love, like everything else, had softened in the heat. A shy girl took to leaving small bundles of herbs on the doorstep of a boy she liked. He left bundles of honeycomb in return. They never spoke of it, not until autumn, but they both knew. And one afternoon, under the wide sky, 2 men who'd once argued over a fence line sat on that same line and shared a loaf of bread, passing it back and forth in silence. No apology was spoken. None was needed. The midsummer festival was simple, as always. A maypole, a roast, a circle of song. But someone had learned to craft paper lanterns, and by nightfall, dozens floated above the village like drifting stars. People stared upward until their necks ached, wondering what it would feel like to fly. That night, every house glowed. Candles were left burning a little longer. Wine was poured with heavier hands. Children fell asleep in piles, and for once, even the dogs did not bark, as though the village itself was holding its breath, not out of fear, but gratitude. There was peace, and even in the dark corners of memory, that peace lingered. The first storm of the summer did not announce itself with thunder. It crept in slowly, draping the skies in grey until even the birds fell quiet. It smelled of wet bark and heavy soil. A hush swept through the village just before the first raindrop hit, sharp, sudden, cold against the cheek. Then came the deluge. It rained for 2 days without pause. Water streamed from eaves, formed puddles in doorways, and turned every footpath into a slippery ribbon of mud. Work stopped. Even the most determined farmers leaned their hoes against the wall and waited. The world had grown too damp to resist. Inside, people huddled. Fires were stoked higher. Cloaks were hung to dry in lines across beams. Children played indoors with whatever they could find. Old tools, scraps of cloth, half-carved figurines forgotten on shelves. In one home, a grandmother took down a chest from the loft. Inside, wrapped in wool, were wooden toys carved decades earlier. A fox with wheels, a lopsided knight, a unicorn whose horn had been worn to a nub. She handed them out one by one to her grandchildren, each one received as if it were treasure, and to them it was. The rain softened everything. Tempers, sorrows, even long-held grief seemed lighter, easier to hold when the sky cried too. One man, widowed 3 winters ago, finally spoke his wife's name aloud again, not in sadness, but as part of a story. He remembered how she used to hum during storms, said it made the walls feel less lonely. That night, he hummed the tune for his daughter, who had never known it. When the rain stopped, the world smelled new. The grass was taller, the rivers ran fuller, the trees dripped slowly, their leaves glittering in the light like coins. And in the village, people emerged as though from a long dream. They moved slower, spoke softer. There was something sacred in the air, as if the storm had washed away more than dust. And yet, it wasn't long before laughter returned. A group of teenagers dared each other to leap over the widest puddles. 2 girls raced down the lane barefoot, shrieking with delight as mud flew up their legs. Even the blacksmith, stern and thick-armed, was seen grinning as he helped right a toppled cart that had slipped in the softened road. No one cursed the rain. It had given them rest, perspective, an excuse to pause. As the sun returned, the work resumed, and so did the rhythms. The fields thrived. Rows of peas, beans, barley, and rye lifted themselves toward the sky. Some mornings, a thin mist clung to the soil like a second skin, and people moved through it quietly, unwilling to disturb its stillness. By now, the villagers knew which crops were struggling and which might overflow their sacks. They planned accordingly, always with the long view in mind. Not just tomorrow's meal, but next season's storehouse. And all the while, the wheel of life turned. A woman gave birth during the rain. Her cries joined the wind, and when the child emerged silent at first, then suddenly wailing, the healer wrapped him in cloths warmed by the hearth. He was named Alder, for the trees that grew strongest near water. A week later, the entire village gathered near the chapel to bless him, not in ceremony, but in presence. Each person, even those stooped with age or bruised by grief, came. They touched the child's foot, whispered their names, promised they would help him grow. In that moment, the village was a single body, a single breath. Not all days were as radiant. As midsummer passed, tensions re-emerged. A dispute over the shared well. A broken plough blamed on careless lending. A fever that took 2 infants before it could be named. These things happened, as they always had, but they did not undo the kindnesses. Grief did not cancel joy. The people simply wove both into their lives like threads of different colors in the same cloth. A boy who had lost his sister began carving small animals from wood. He left them anonymously outside neighbors' doors. A squirrel, a cat, a badger with 2 long ears. Each one was signed only with a dot on the bottom. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. And everyone left something in return. A ribbon, a carved button, a baked plum. That was the rhythm of the place. Seasons folded over each other like linens tucked in a drawer. Each left its scent, its weight, its worn softness. By late summer, the fields burned gold. The wheat bowed under its own abundance. The beans hung thick on their vines. Even the orchard, once considered barren, surprised them with apples small and tart but plentiful. The air was thick with promise and dust. Harvest was not a single day. It was a season of aching limbs and hopeful calculation. They moved through it with reverence. Men bent low, scythes whispering through stalks. Women tied bundles with worn hands, fingers stained with husk and juice. Children chased off crows and carried baskets. Even the elderly found purpose sorting, stacking, sharpening tools. Every grain gathered was a step away from hunger. At night, they barely spoke. They ate in silence, shoulders brushing in tight spaces, eyes half-lidded with weariness. But the silence was not empty. It was full of shared effort, of trust, of knowing that every hand had held the weight of the season. A few nights into the harvest, the healer lit lanterns along the chapel path. No one asked why, but when the moon rose, the villagers followed the flickering light to the door. Inside, the air was cool and still. She had placed a single loaf of bread on the altar. No blessing, no sermon, just bread. One by one, they stepped forward, broke off a piece, ate it in silence, a communion not of faith, but of survival. That night, they slept deeply. Even the dogs did not bark. And when morning came, they rose again, stooped, sore, and satisfied to finish what they'd begun. Because that was the way of things. Work until the work was done. Rest. Begin again. As the days shortened, so too did tempers. Fatigue bred friction. A snapped rope led to a shouted argument. A broken rake resulted in a slammed door. But each rift was mended. Not always with words, often with a loaf left on a doorstep, or a favorite tool returned quietly in the night. There was one boy who refused to speak at all that season. Not out of stubbornness, but sorrow. His mother had fallen ill and never quite recovered. She sat in the corner now, blinking slowly, her hands unmoving in her lap. He carried on, chopping wood, drawing water, checking the bread, never speaking. And yet the village spoke to him. They left honey on his steps, a blanket embroidered with hawks, a candle carved into the shape of a fox. He never thanked them aloud, but he kept each gift arranged neatly on a shelf, dusted every day. Eventually, the frost returned. Not in force, but in breath. The kind that kissed the grass before sunrise and made windows bloom with ice flowers. The harvest was over. The stores were full, or as full as they could be, and once again the village prepared to draw inward. But not just yet. There was still warmth, still song, still the harvest feast. It began with a single bonfire stacked high in the commons. Then came the tables, planks set atop barrels, covered with cloths and every dish the village could muster. Pies of beet and onion, breads dusted with flour so fine it looked like snow, apples roasted in honey, stews thick with barley and bits of smoked meat. They ate with abandon, and when they were full, they danced. Not because they had to, because they could. Because they had made it through another cycle. Because their hands, their backs, their faith in one another had carried them. Children twirled in mismatched shoes, old men clapped in rhythm. Even the shyest souls sang that night. The stars were clear, the sky was kind, and the village slept that night with full bellies, full hearts, and the knowledge that no matter what the next season brought, they would meet it together. With the harvest behind them, and the last flames of autumn dimming into the hush of approaching winter, the village slowed its breath. The trees, once bursting with gold and fire-colored leaves, stood bare now, their branches reaching like old hands toward the gray sky. Wind rustled through them like whispered memories. The ground hardened beneath careful feet. It was time again for the turning inward. Wood piles grew tall and proud, stacked tight against cottage walls. Smoke drifted from chimneys, curling into the pale air like silent prayers. Doors creaked open less often. Voices were heard more through walls than across fields. Children played closer to home now, bundled in wool that smelled faintly of smoke and sun-dried herbs. The chapel bell rang more often, not in warning, but in welcome. People gathered around the hearths, where the fire became the center of everything. News, comfort, laughter, worry, it all burned there. Meals were simpler again, roots and grains, stews with tough cuts of meat softened over hours. But they were shared, and that made them rich. Bread was dipped in broth, crumbs were caught before they fell. Even the poorest found something to offer. One boy with a twisted ankle spent the season weaving cords from flax. He tied them into bracelets and passed them out to anyone who brought him stories. In this way, he became the keeper of tales. By winter's end, his walls were covered in yarns, not written, but remembered. There was a girl who painted her dreams in soot and crushed berries on scraps of bark. A man who sang lullabies he claimed were taught to him by a wandering monk, though no one knew if that was true. A grandmother who could read the future in candle drips, though her only prophecy was always tomorrow will come, just as today did. And still, time moved. The river slowed, thickened at its edges with ice. The birds changed their calls, became fewer. The ground sparkled with frost, every step a soft crunch. Yet even now, life pulsed through the village. A woman made cloaks from old quilts and gave them to anyone whose breath fogged too quickly. She stitched each one with a different symbol, an owl, a sun, a tiny handprint, so they would be known, marked, protected. A boy learned to play a bone flute and practiced only in the early mornings, his notes haunting and soft. He thought no one listened. He was wrong. In the depth of winter, when daylight was brief and night stretched like a shadow over all, someone began placing lanterns in trees. One by one they appeared, hung from low branches, simple glassless holders with small flames that flickered in the wind. No one saw who lit them, no one claimed them, but they stayed lit, even in the snow, especially in the snow. Children called them tree stars, elders said they were memories, and on the longest night the whole village gathered beneath them. No speech was made, no song was sung, just silence, a warm, hushed silence, broken only by the soft shiver of snow falling from high boughs, the occasional crackle of someone shifting on cold ground, and the beating of many hearts that somehow managed to keep rhythm. In that quiet there was no fear, no hunger, no war, no lords or laws or ledger books, only people, breathing together, sharing the same cold and the same hope. The healer passed around a pot of spiced broth, ladled carefully into waiting hands. The blacksmith gave the children little bells to tie to their boots so they could hear each other in the dark. A widow passed around chestnuts roasted in honey and said nothing when she was left with none. And the stars watched, high above as they had always done. Winter would deepen. It always did. There would be colds and cuts and quiet losses. There would be long stretches of grey, of aching joints and slow mornings. But also, there would be snowball fights and stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. There would be the scent of pine smoke on wool and the glow of orange through shutter slats and boots left side by side at every threshold. The people would endure, as they always had. And in time, frost would recede. The snow would loosen its hold. Buds would push their way up through half-frozen earth, tender and determined. The river would rush again, the sun would return in full, waking the world with golden fingers. And someone, some curious child perhaps, would pull aside the curtain of the old year and say, "It smells like growing." And so the wheel would turn, because it always had and always will. In the stillness that came between frost and thaw, there was a pause in the land, the kind of hush that made every sound, creaking timber, soft cough, shifting in bed, feel more noticeable. In these weeks, the villagers seemed to retreat even further into themselves, not from fear or loneliness, but from something older. A rhythm passed down without words. They called it the waiting time. It was neither harvest nor planting, not yet the celebration of spring nor the morning of winter's grip. It was a season in between, fleeting, overlooked, and yet essential. The waiting time was for repair, for reflection, for preparing the inside of things, minds, hearts, tools, homes. Windows were cleaned not for vanity, but to greet light when it returned. Clothing was mended not with urgency, but with intention. Wool unraveled from worn socks became thread for stitches in tunics passed down 3 times. In the corners of small cottages, people carved spoons, not because they lacked them, but because the quiet required purpose. A man might whittle a spoon to replace the one he made 10 years earlier and still use every day. Not better, just newer. Just a reminder that time moves on and hands remember. In those same corners, some began passing along stories that only appeared during the waiting. They weren't grand tales of kings or miracles. They were tales of hearth spirits, of moss that grows upside down when spring will be dry, of a certain owl that always flies low before a good year. These stories weren't believed in the modern sense, but they were held, cupped like a warm mug, not tested, just trusted for what they offered. One story was passed on by an old man who had stopped walking 2 winters ago. He sat wrapped in 5 layers near the window, watching the birds and the snow, and anyone who came close enough would hear his voice rise in rhythm like a song. Once long ago, when fire was new and bread had no salt. The story always changed. Sometimes it was about a girl who wove spring from cloud threads. Other times it was about a fox who spoke with the moon. The villagers knew it was made up. but they also knew it wasn't. During this in-between season, hunger hummed just under the floorboards. Not sharp, just present. Enough to make each meal an event. A slice of onion, a crust of bread dipped in broth. Nothing was wasted. Everything was shared. One day, a child found a lump of beeswax under a bench. It had likely fallen from a bundle the prior fall. She rolled it in her hands until it was warm, then shaped it into a figure, a crooked bear, missing one leg. She gave it to the healer, who placed it on her shelf next to dried roots and jars of cloudy tinctures. That bear stood there for many years, its missing leg never replaced. On clear days, some of the stronger villagers ventured to the forest's edge to gather fallen branches. It was dangerous work. Ice clung to the earth, and the risk of slipping was constant. But those who went did so in pairs, with ropes tied at their waists, their breath misting like ghosts as they walked. When they returned, arms full of wood, fingers stiff and red, they were welcomed like returning warriors. Not with cheers, but with warm hands pulling the doors open, boots removed by someone else, bowls of soup already steaming. And so the waiting continued. One morning without fanfare, the first snowdrop bloomed, tiny, pale, and quivering. It pushed up through ice-crusted soil near the path behind the blacksmith's home. A boy saw it while fetching water and ran to fetch the others. Within the hour, 10 people had come to stare at it. No one touched it. No one spoke loudly. They simply looked. That evening, the baker made a small sweet from the last of the dried plums and gave it to the boy. For seeing the first, she said. Days later, more flowers arrived, slowly, almost reluctantly, and then the buds, and then the birds, and then the air changed, not warm but soft, like a hand on your shoulder after a long cry. Soon the elders began watching the sky for different signs, the color of the clouds, the scent of early morning. They looked for starlings gathering, for bees buzzing near bark, for the return of the wind that moved from south to north. And one morning the bell rang, 3 times, long and low. The planting was to begin. The first day of planting was not marked by trumpets or rituals. It began with the sound of shovels slicing into damp earth. The sun had not yet lifted fully, but the villagers were already at work, their movements slow and certain. Hands knew what to do long before minds had woken fully. Seeds had been dried and saved, held in little cloth pouches, tucked into corners all winter like promises folded small. One man knelt in the field and whispered something to the soil before placing the first seed. No one asked what. Everyone understood. Children were given small, light tools, not because their help was needed. Truthfully, they often slowed things down, but because it mattered that they were there. That they learned by doing, the way earth opens itself with patience. How to tuck things in rather than bury them. How to believe without seeing that growth would come. The blacksmith's daughter was seen pressing her palm gently into the ground after each row of beans, as though sealing a pact. The baker sang under her breath as she scattered seeds, old songs, fragmentary ones, handed down by someone whose face she could no longer recall, but whose voice lived in the melody. And all through the fields, a quiet hope took root. It wasn't the loud, tearful kind. It was the kind that settled in joints and muscles, made people stand taller without noticing, made them speak a little softer, hold each other's gaze a little longer. In the days that followed, the weather danced. Rain came and went like a visitor with changing moods. Some days were warm, others still held a bite. But the ground softened and green things began to push upward, first in hesitant shoots, then in eager clusters. The rhythm of life accelerated just slightly. One morning, the girl who had made soot paintings in winter strung a cord between 2 posts and began hanging new pieces, this time drawn in colored chalk on rough bark, with depictions of sprouting herbs, sunlit courtyards, the river laughing with spring melt. Villagers paused as they passed, not to judge or critique, but to nod quietly. That was all she needed. The mill wheel spun faster now. The stream it drank from was swollen and chattering, and the grain brought for grinding smelled fresher, less like storage, more like promise. The sound of the wheel turning became the heartbeat of the season. Horses returned to the fields. So did laughter. With the warmth came visitors. Some were familiar, traders from nearby hamlets, known by face if not by name. Others were new, their accents strange, their clothing stitched with patterns the villagers hadn't seen. There was a man who carved whistles from driftwood and sold them for nothing more than stories. A woman who carried a basket of dyed threads and would braid a color into your sleeve if you asked kindly. A mute boy with a monkey on his shoulder who performed handstands in the grass until the village children gave him apples. None stayed long, but each left something behind. A song, a scent, a memory, and the village absorbed them. With each day, the fields grew thicker. Green rows stretched farther. The barn cats grew fatter and lazier, chasing flies more for sport than need. The dogs lay belly up in the sun, snoring loud enough to rattle fences. The crows returned to perch on rooftops like ancient sentinels, overseeing the slow work of life as if they had seen it all before and would see it again. One evening, after a long day of weeding and mending fences, the villagers gathered near the central well. No reason, no festival, just a natural drift of bodies toward warmth and togetherness. Someone lit a fire, someone else brought a loaf. A girl with a broken lyre strummed it anyway, its crooked notes filling the air with imperfect music. There was no agenda, no plan, just people, being. The elder who had stopped walking 2 winters ago was brought out on a wheeled chair. Someone tucked a shawl around his shoulders. He watched the firelight flicker in the eyes of people he'd seen grow from nothing. "Still here," he said once, to no one in particular. But several heads nodded because the words held weight. Later that night, when the embers had cooled and only a few lingered, the stars revealed themselves in full, a great silken canopy of light. Not one person looked away. In that silence, beneath that endless sky, they saw not just constellations, but continuity. Generations past, seasons ahead, the shape of things that stay, no matter how small or slow or quiet. And in that moment, it didn't matter that time would keep moving, that storms would come, that winter would return again. Because something in the village had been proven once more. Life turns, but it does not leave, not truly, not forever. The healer, now old, placed her palm on the ground that night before going inside. "Still warm," she murmured, as if speaking to a child, as if the land could feel it, as if it could answer, and perhaps in its own way it did. Because in the mornings that followed, the wind smelled of mint and wheat. The sun arrived sooner, the birds sang longer, and the people woke with fewer aches. The stories continued. So did the seeds. So did the hands passing bread and the eyes catching eyes, and the quiet that wrapped each evening like a soft cloth around a weary day. The village lived, and so did the memory of all it had endured.